where, the models can help you, but it's almost like I know what I've got right now, and do I need it to be a little cooler, or can it be a little warmer? And so in a forecast where you're looking at going from maybe 98 degrees in Reading to 115, you probably are going to need to put some cooler water into the system. And 2 days ahead, temperature-wise, is a little better than a week ahead. But so then you probably want to make some changes, and you need to kind of measure what you think is the amount of cooler water. So it's an action at the dam, at the control device, and what you think will move through the power plant, and then that would kind of migrate down, and then kind of make an adjustment up or down from there. Now, we've been fooled by the temperature, just like anything, but this is a little more, has a lot more eyes on it. If things heat up faster, then you got to kind of scramble and kind of move towards that. So even in 90-5, I think there's a recognition that it takes 2 or 3 days to kind of deal with some of these, particularly if the temperatures are spiky. I will say, and we're on a little bit of a learning curve in that for this time of year, we're talking about flows that are lower than we would typically see. Ordinarily, we may be talking 10, even up to 11,000 CFS releases. Now we're talking closer to 7,000. So that's going to be more sensitive to some of this temperature regime once you release it. Probably less so in the reservoir, but so that's the other thing that comes into play. So this is kind of an interesting diagram. So probably just to try to summarize what we've got in the plan that'll be coming, is we're trying to target as close as we can to 57 degrees at the CCR gauge, which is at Bonneville Bridge, which is a ways downstream. So it's anywhere, depending on the day, a half a degree, maybe upward to a degree cooler up where the reds are. So you're probably closer to 56, anywhere from 56.5 to 56 at that location. We're going to be looking, when we decide whether to make changes, at the same time to this new gauge, which is really close to where most of the reds are setting up. The third bullet, we will have, and the logic is to have some short-term exceedances, so to speak, of above the 57, but try to keep those below 58, because we do have this little bit of a buffer, and we're trying to really save cold water. So if you looked at some of the traces that Garwin had of last year, we consistently stayed below the 56 degree number, which was great for 3/4 of the season, and then we kind of ran out of cold water. So this allows that to go up, and the thinking is that although there's some increased mortality there, that's a smaller relative number cumulatively than a runaway up to 60 degrees later on in the season.
I guess this is just because I've been around so long, but whenever we have managed, I'm mostly familiar with ocean fisheries, whenever we've managed to a maximum number and you manage toward that, it gets away from us. It just does. And I mean, you really do have to be very conservative as you're heading in that direction. And so
Right.
it makes me real nervous when you say that, that you don't want to go above 58, but you're going to manage to 57 and expect that it'll get up above. Well, it's going to get up above, and it's going to probably get above 58 too. That's how these fish and natural systems work. It's just very hard for us to manage as humans.
It is really difficult. Now, what's interesting, if you look at these gauges, the Keswick release temperature has very little variation night to day, interestingly enough, because it's a bigger, deeper flow of water through the reservoir. And when you get to Clear Creek, you obviously see the diurnal changes that go into that. It's a little more dampened at this location, primarily because you're closer to kind of this even temperature that then kind of the oscillation, the amplitude gets bigger. As we learn with this, we're going to kind of keep on this. But typically when we've talked about excursions above whatever the target temperature is, it's typically been a half a degree. It's been kind of the rule of thumb. We've got a degree. It doesn't mean that we're going to be riding up on this 58, but it is kind of there as, given it's got an additional buffer of the time, that again, probably here in the early part of the season, because we're trying to save that cold water, that's probably at least right now, the type of trade-off that we're doing in a real-time discussion. If we progress through into July and we see that we're saving up things and it's not as much of a risk, then we're going to have a lot less tolerance for the 58. This stuff's going to be closer to the 57 because there's a cumulative effect with this. And one of the things that's on my last slide is one of the things that's in the plan is that No Fisheries has volunteered to kind of do a cumulative heat collective mortality estimate. Maybe not mortality, but certainly as you come along and it's not really one exceedance, but if it's accumulation of 5 of these, then that has a cumulative effect. So we're going to kind of track this, and if we've kind of used a couple, I don't want to sound like a video game, but if you kind of used a couple of your chances here, then you're going to be far less tolerant. You're going to want to build in just a little more cushion as you go into the later part of the season. We're trying to delay, as Garwin said, this full site gate operation as long as possible, trying to get that as far and deep into October as we can. That's kind of the lessons learned of last year. So a lot of this is kind of to that. We're starting the base flow on this at 7,250 for June and July. Collectively on how we've planned out from an operational standpoint, that would likely continue into August. But June, July, as we talked about earlier, gives us some base operation to see if we need to adjust up and down for that. So I want to kind of de-emphasize the August piece of this until we at least get this part under our belt. And obviously a real-time ops team that's much more focused than maybe the Sac River Temperature Task Group, in that they'll be looking at some similar things, but really strategizing on a 2-day out, particularly if we're into a warmer part of the regime. These are the flows, just real quickly, that we've got as kind of the base that is in the plan that then we've looked at in terms of what would occur in terms of the rest of the operations. Need to dwell on that. We've talked about it. This is a graph I did want to share because it goes to a question we've had even in past workshops. One of the things that we're doing here to build in some additional consideration, because one of the key things, particularly as we go to lower flows, is the ambient weather conditions. The National Weather Service, and we've seen this in some of Bill's plots in the past, put out a 3-month ahead outlook. And we usually see them in a lot of our discussions with the precipitation. They also do a temperature outlook, and they do this every month for the 3-month ahead. So what we have done in the past, if we went back, say, 6-7 years ago, this is an input to our temperature model, or it would be into any temperature model. And ordinarily, if you were to look at this kind of S-curve at the 50% exceedance, and the red line here is kind of the 30-year average, there's a temperature there that's probably, and it's probably not that material as to what it is, probably around 79 degrees. That might be the typical number that we've gone into a temperature model of this type. Say, okay, it's kind of average August, average July. But we're incorporating the forecast from the Weather Service. In this case, what they're projecting is across a distribution of probability, probably a degree warmer. So over the last few years, we've used this forecasted number in our forecasts and temperature modeling, but we've typically used the 50% exceedance number. Recognizing that last year was very, very warm, and that we've had a very warm period here in the first part of 2015, we've also run the model using a 90% exceedance set of data. And in this particular case, this is the data point that comes out of the National Weather Service's forecast for around Shasta Dam. And that's where the red arrow is pointing to. And that's, in essence, 2 degrees warmer than the 50%. So what we've done to try to build in a question around the question, do we think this thing is going to work? We've run the temperature models that we have using this median forecasted temperatures for the next 3 months based on hitting 56 degrees at the Clear Creek Bonneville gauge. And then we've run the entire summer at this warmer temperature, which adds another couple of degrees, and said, how many times would we hit this 58 number? And can we stay within that? Meaning that if it's really, really towards this warmer end of the probability scale, are we just going to see runaway temperatures all season? And what does that mean? So in this particular case, and as Carl and Larry and Gerwin and John can attest to, we've run a whole bunch of different runs for SWEET. So I've picked one that's kind of representative here from some things we've been looking at over the last few weeks. And this is applying a set of temperature operations at Shasta to hit 56 degrees at the CCR gauge, but then taking that set of runs and operations and taking out the 50% forecasted weather temperature forecast and putting this 10% on top of that. So assuming that the air temperatures are 2 degrees warmer than this kind of above normal number that you used, can you stay below this 58 degree number? And this is something in this particular run that tried to indicate, well, how many exceedances of the 58 and by how much might that look like? And we did this for a range of increments of releases, particularly in the June, July, August timeframe, to see where does this kind of optimize, because the lower the flow you go, might be a slower burn rate with the cooler pool, but you have to have a cooler temperature to start with to survive that through particularly a warm regime. And I just kind of show on here in this simulation, that little sawtooth that this blue arrow is pointing to, that's the point in time in this simulation that we hit the full side gate operation. In this case, it's probably, I don't know, October 7th. Now, what happens then is that kind of rides over a little bit of hump, and so you're kind of in the temperature management standpoint kind of coasting with the last bit of cold water you have, and how does that match up with this particular set of meteorology? What happened with this a year ago is when we got to this point, and it was way back towards the beginning of September, that hill just kept going and riding up, and then by the time you got to late in September, we were into this 60-degree realm, which is where we probably saw a lot of mortality. But this is the type of things that we've been looking at over the last couple of weeks to try to dial in the question of playing risks, and we've done it with a range of temperatures that we might experience up there to the extreme of even being at this 10% 3-month outlook. And it's not a trivial amount of heating that's associated with that. That's my point with the other graph. So probably to kind of close this out, it's not just, okay, rerun the temperature model, do these flows, do this particular temperature compliance point. The things that we've done is we've added a new gauge. It's up on CDEC, so everybody can take a look at it. It's very close to where a lot of the spawning is going on. We're working with NOAA on deploying some additional temperature sensors to have a redundancy in the process for looking at the cold water pool and the water moving through Keswick. That should be up and running this summer. I think, from my understanding, the State Fish and Wildlife is doing some kind of amping up on the red surveys and the river monitoring, and will be doing that well in through the rest of the summer into the fall to help us observe what's on the river, and as we migrate through flow changes, is there stranding concerns, is there red dewatering concerns, all those types of things that should influence how we operate and make changes. As I said, Garwin's group is going to be doing a tracking report of temperature exposure. So if a question is, okay, this weekend you've kind of been anywhere between 57 and 58 degrees at the location where the reds are, we're going to log that and kind of track the cumulative exposure to temperature. And if we got it in a run where that's pretty high, then that influences our decision making as we go forward. So that all rolls into a lot more intense real-time discussions. We'll be doing some more of that probably at lunch today to think about changes in the critical elements of the management of the coal water pool. There's been an increase of taking in winter run fish at Livingston Stone National Hatchery to try to get 400 adults in there, just as a hedge against the wild population that's in play here. And we've got we're committed to work with Reclamation North Fisheries are going to kind of chair a multi-agency discussion about, let's look at all of our tools that kind of help with our decision support so that next year, particularly early in the year, what are the types of things we should be looking at? And is it full-blown temperature models with a lot of uncertain data, or are there other things that can kind of hedge against that as well to kind of inform us as to when we make some decisions, particularly if we're going to be at another drier year. Again, as we talked about before, if Shasta doesn't fill enough to get to the upper row of shutters, that really hampers the blending capability at Shasta. And this is on second year in a row of a kind of a two-level operation, which does have its limitations and risks. So that's pretty much the material I had as far as the slides. One of the things that we have been working on is with the 7250 release flow, obviously compared to the previous plan, there's a lot of operational supply implications to that. And as Garwin and Carl kind of mentioned, there's a lot of hard decisions in the discussion about kind of setting that as a base set point here. It does rely a lot on Oroville and Folsom, but not to the point that it has some risks associated, and it certainly isn't optimal in terms of those storage conditions by the time you get to September, October. But we think we've got contingency plans that work with that. It does allow for a very, very small amount of delta pumping in the event that depletions to the rest of the valley are as high as we think. If those depletions are a little bit less, then maybe we're at the lower end of the range that may have been forecasted because it's still an unknown, then that probably gives us an opportunity to back a little more water upstream into those two reservoirs and to maybe augment some pumping. And, I think it does allow us to then look at the fish conditions when we get to October, November, to maybe augment the flows that we currently have in this plan or as a forecast, to then do some payback of any other exchanges that kind of help keep the wheels on in terms of south of Delta and even in the American River for that matter. So I guess my report on how I'm seeing the water users coming together, I see a lot of cooperation. Again, the real grease to some of that is how can we operate when we get to the fall? And it'll all depend a lot on how these temperatures look and how successful we are with this plan as it's constructed.
Do you think you have all the talent you need for all the modeling work that is being done and needs to be done? I mean, I know when we came up against the problems with our modeling for some other totally different areas, we really had to bring in academic outside third-party people because we simply just didn't have the talent, So
I think, well, from an operational standpoint, operating the device, I think within my operations group within Reclamation, I think we've got what we need. I think that there's been a lot of additional tools kind of brought to the table through NOAA Fisheries and their Science Center that have been very useful and have provided some additional data. But as Garwin kind of said, there's a lot of huddling around plots and what's the trend line from 2 days ago. I do think that what we are seeing is that there would, obviously in the computer world, software / modeling, there's probably a better widget out there. And they usually have a lot better output graphically, which, I think some of this work that we talked about working with, co-chairing with NOAA Fisheries is under the guise of, hey, what other things are out there? Both maybe just, is it the guts of the computational piece of a model? Is it the output? Because there may be better computational components that we could look at, better output presentation that may highlight trends that may be very useful. What are some techniques for input? One of the things about the temperature data is that's not a model question. It's kind of like, okay, what data do you want to put in there? And what's your best data that you have at a particular time that represents some of your risk? So we're probably going to be probing this question, through the summer into the fall. Next spring we'll probably be able to say, okay, what do we have that's better than we had this year in the spring? But it's probably a couple of year program to just kind of tune up our complete toolbox to say, okay, what gives us the best information? So I'm probably going to be this advocate. I love models, and I think that they are very, very useful. And I'm probably more in the models are useful as the models are, all models are wrong, but they only give you so much. And something as complicated as this and the moving parts of where are the fish, how good is the forecast, for your next, 3 days out. How well do you understand the physical device itself? It's one thing to model it. It's another thing to live with its idiosyncrasies of how water goes through and adjusting on the fly. So modeling, I think we've got that. I mean, obviously, in this process over the last couple of weeks where we've done dozens and dozens of runs, you always worry about your staff getting a little bit of a burnout at some point. But once we get into more of a management production mode, that becomes a lot easier.
So could I jump in? Just a similar question on, do you have what you need resources for monitoring? And that would be for the fish agencies as well.
Well, I think from the department's perspective, we have the resources we need. We've received augmentations in the last 2 years' budgets to conduct drought monitoring expanded. So I think we're doing pretty well there. And I think other resources, particularly these temperature probes that have come through the Science Center on the NOAA side, have been really helpful and will be helpful as we go forward, plus the installation of the sat gauge at Highway 44. So I think we're doing pretty well on the monitoring perspective.
Bill, you have that look.
To see if you want me to follow up on state water project side or John with regard to the modeling resource needs. And so I think like Cal Fish and Wildlife, the departments work pretty hard with the Department of Finance, legislators, and ultimately the governor and the budget. And so we're looking forward to this year actually expanding or having more resources available to stay on top of Delta and some of the things that have been developed over, like turbidity monitoring in real time to help ops in the Delta as well as exports, but also kind of looking at Feather River and State Water Project needs as we kind of get, again, tighter and tighter and look across now the northern Sacramento Valley on that issue. So I think we're resource-wise, we're set up. Obviously, as Ron said, modelers are, I think every day we're throwing new questions and comments at them. And, we need that information back as fast as we can. I think I just want to reinforce as part of this conversation, the real-time water operations team, they meet every Monday at 4:00, but there's a lot going on behind to support that conversation to make a team decision like these plans and push this information through the TUCPs and these special plans to you for your consideration. So.
I realize we have a lot of speakers stacked up to go. This has been very helpful, and it's taken a while, but I think it's given us a sense of how much more sophisticated the approach is that you all have taken in stepping up to the challenge, and to have to digest a little bit of it. But Ron, before you go, our next panel will be the folks from the Sacramento area, the American River Water User Panel, and you didn't have to read the paper this morning to understand why they're nervous. Before they speak, I mean, what would you say? You meet with them all the time, but why should they not be? How can they sleep at night, I guess, is the question. How would you want to tee up the transition?
I'd be happy to sit with them on the panel, and I can help them
good.
there. But, we are looking, we're sensitive to, I think, two things. One is the lake levels as it relates to making sure that supplies don't get interrupted to those, communities. And I think Carl touched on this as well. We have some real concerns about the balancing of habitat and, cold water availability for steelhead over the summer as well as
we'll hear some
fall run.
speakers about that as well.
And so to that question, I think we need to really roll up our sleeves and work with our partners within the American River Basin to take what we've got as kind of a base and be able to build some more buffer in terms of that storage and flexibility for cold water. And hopefully the summer will progress where we don't see a real need for the higher outflows that kind of have to be companion with this plan. The makeup of this reduction at Keswick is being made up in part at both Oroville and Folsom. So we've got some fairly high numbers there, and if that can be cut back, if we see more favorable conditions in terms of flow hitting the delta, that's certainly going to be a knob that we're going to pull back from. So that was one of the balancing questions within the agencies, trying to work to a set point here, was to be able to at least get to this 120,000 acre feet at the end of September at Folsom, to be able to then have a place to build from there. Because that does have a lot of built-in contingency planning to it. That's a number I think that we can hit. And there may be some points where some of our pumping may be dialed back even more. As hard as that's going to be, I think that this is going to be what some of us refer to as more of a hard stop, is that we've got to get to this 120. Because if we come in below that too early, then what's going to happen is the demands in these communities are going to be higher than we can probably accommodate with some temporary pumps. So part of this is to delay the lake getting to a certain point till the demands kind of drop off, and that becomes a little more manageable. So being a resident of Placer County, I understand the concern, and we're going to continue to be trying to find assets to be able to maintain the storage up there and try to get some flexibility as it relates to the cold water management.
Well, thank you for staying around for that. I have a question for folks. I know I said we would take a lunch break. I'm happy to keep going if that's okay with you guys, and people can run and grab something if they need to for sustenance. Is that all right? At some point, are you all right, you guys? But just yeah, the cafe closes. That's right. For a little bit longer, you can get the prepared stuff, but not sandwiches. So just so people can make their plans if they didn't get enough of a snack. So with that, we'll keep going. We will take a bio break at some point in a little while, just to be kind. So let's move to the American River Water User Panel. Thank you all very, very much for your time. Yeah, he left it to them. Good.
All righty.
Good afternoon.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Marcus, members of the board. Marcus Yasutaki, Environmental and Water Resources Director for the City of Folsom. To my left is Jim Pfeiffer with the City of Sacramento. To my right is Tom Goring with the Sacramento Water Forum. I am here today on behalf of the City of Folsom, City of Roseville, and San Juan Water District, who represents Granite Bay, Orangeville Water District, Citrus Heights Water District, and Fair Oaks Water District. So Folsom, Roseville, and San Juan Water District have a direct intake in Folsom Dam, and that's our primary water source for our agencies and our customers. Again, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. We understand not only the position that the board is in, but districts, cities, counties, all across California in managing not only what we have today, but how this will affect what we manage into 2016. So it's a heavy lift for all agencies, and we appreciate the opportunity to speak before you today just on how that may impact our agencies. Want to also thank Reclamation. As you heard before from Ron, we've had weekly and biweekly calls and or meetings to get continuous updates on some of the proposals that are being shopped around and some of the ideas that are discussed. So we want to thank Reclamation for their time that they spend with our agencies. But we do have, as you're probably well aware, various concerns on a proposed storage or target level of 120,000 acre feet at the end of September. Not only from a water supply standpoint, but as Tom will get into, there are also biological effects that will have in the fall. So Tom will speak more to that. We also understand that our agencies need to do our part, and we feel that just based on the information that's been submitted to the State Water Board in the past 2 years, the Sacramento region has been leading in terms of conservation over that time period. Our agencies for the month of May achieved about a 45% savings compared to 2013, and I know City of Folsom, and I'm pretty sure San Juan and Roseville are also tracking fairly well in June as well. You'll see those numbers in July. We are committed to doing our part, and I think the information, the numbers that we submit will show that we are doing our part. One thing I want to do now is just bring attention to the slide before you, and for those in the audience, it's basically a graphic showing Folsom Lake over the 2013 year from June through December and then January of the following year. So if you're looking at, let's say, the orangish yellow colored line, it's the 2013 hydrology going into 2014. The darker blue line is 2014 going into 2015. And the brownish orange colored line is a forecast that we received last week at American River Group meeting that shows where end of June storage will be and where end of September storage plans to be based on the new plan, which we have all seen and heard is about 120,000 acre feet at the end of September. If you look at just the numbers from June to August, that's about a 70%, close to a 70% amount of water that's released just in those 2 months. So you can see our concern of getting down to 120,000 acre feet at the end of September, moving into the next water year and into the fall. So what we've also provided is a couple other lines. The line that's brown that moves up to 161,000 acre feet at the end of September, or sorry, end of December, that's a 90% exceedance probability provided by Reclamation if we have maybe what would be a historic precip or inflow in the fall. But we've also looked at if we had a fall that was similar to 2013 going into 2014, and you had a release flow of 800 CFS, that's the darker blue line or purple line. And if we were looking at flows that had 800 CFS with that same fall projections or the same actual flow numbers, you're looking at the green line, and you can see it goes from 120,000 acre feet to the end of January at 40,000 acre feet. And as Ron had mentioned, there is a contingency plan in terms of floating a temporary pump station, but I want to caution everybody that that is a plan that, one, hasn't been tested, two, is not in place, and three, has never been done before here in Folsom. So a contingency plan relying on all of that is very concerning for us in terms of not being able to get water from our intake or to our customers. And you can see the shaded patterns in yellow and then in the reddish color that as we start to drop off or move closer towards the end of the year, you can see where reclamation can use existing facilities to meet our demands, and hopefully going forward as they tail off or demands start to lessen in the fall, we can stay along a pattern that's a flatter line or move up. But we've also heard before that hope for rain and hope really isn't a plan. So, we want to make sure that we stick to that. But as you get into the red or the pinkish color, that's where our big concern is, because that's moving from the end of this year into the end of, or to the beginning of next year. And we have many concerns. Just one, the risk of a dry fall and what that will do for water supply next year, not only for our customers, but for fisheries downstream in the lower American River, but also the risk of a potential solution or a backup contingency plan that hasn't ever been done before here. And you can see probably where our concerns are coming from. And one thing, we did hear about a release or 250 CFS that was able to be saved. I believe 2 days ago or yesterday, the announcement came out that they would not have to release 250 CFS. That's about a 500 acre foot a day difference. So those types of changes or plans that are proposed that maintain even small releases or minimize a release have a significant impact at Folsom. And one of the things Tom will mention in his discussion is just what type of impacts some of those releases have. And he also has some ideas on if there are other changes that we could make or that can be made, those, if they can benefit storage in the system, and for us particularly in Folsom, that's what we're looking to do. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jim Pfeiffer with the City of Sacramento. And
thank you, Marcus. Thank you, Chair Marcus and members of the board for this opportunity to comment on the temperature management plan discussion. So we at the City of Sacramento share the concerns that Mr. Yasutake expressed regarding the low projected reservoir conditions at Folsom Reservoir. We're also concerned about low flows on the American River. The City of Sacramento relies on the lower American River to stay above about 500 CFS to prevent potentially severe pump damage at our American River diversion. We've been working closely with Reclamation to coordinate operations and avoid problems where possible. And I really do appreciate that collaborative relationship that we've developed with Reclamation this year. We'll certainly continue to do that. However, we appreciate that the drought is really threatening everybody's water supply, and we have a part in this process too. We have been reducing our demands. I think the latest result is 35% for the City of Sacramento. Over the years, we've worked pretty closely with the Folsom diverters. We have they're our partners, and their success is our success, and vice versa. But we're collectively asking you and your staff to work on a revised temperature management plan and consult with the cities of Sacramento, Roseville, Folsom, and the San Juan Water District so we may better understand and contribute to potential solutions. And in that spirit of collaboration and providing solutions, I want to turn it over to Tom Goring, who's going to talk about a water form proposal and a potential solution to keep Folsom Reservoir from going below 120,000 acre feet. And in some ways, they're working on it, but
Yep.
we have more to contribute.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the board. I really appreciate you making time for a panel on the American River Sacramento region. I wish I could say I'm delighted to be here. but it's just bad. It's just bad, and we're feeling it like everyone else. So we didn't want to come and just complain. We know that we have a right to do that, just like everyone else is, but we wanted to complain, and then also suggest some ideas. We do that feeling a little uncomfortable because the request we're making, the suggestion that we're making, is outside of our basin. We have sort of had a history of working with reclamation and the fish agencies on the Lower American River on operations at Folsom, and we've kind of said what happens out in the Delta and out on the Sacramento River and Oroville, it's not our deal. We understand you have constraints and what's going on there, and we're actually making a suggestion for something outside our basin, and we feel a little weird about that. But we're a little bit emboldened by the comments that Ron and Carl Wilcox made earlier about a reduction in a planned increase at Folsom. One of their operations alerts came out a few days ago, said we're going up to 3,000. And then a day later they said, let's cancel that. We're not sure exactly why that happened, but we think it's because of exactly the kind of thing we're talking about. So with that background, I'm Tom Goring. I work for this group called the Water Forum. I know all the board members are familiar with us. For those of you who aren't, we have members, about 40 members in the Sacramento region that include the local water interests, business interests, and local environmental community. And those folks signed a comprehensive agreement back in 2000 that said we would collectively try to protect local water supplies, make sure that they're reliable, and protect the ecological resources of the Lower American River. We called that simultaneous thing co-equal objectives. That term's been since co-opted by others, but we were the first. So that's who we are. So this is our proposal. Can I have the clicker? First, let me finish with the whining before I get into the proposal. Mark has talked about the whining around water supply. We're going to get really low storage that we've pretty much never seen before. And it's scary. It's scary because we're not sure how the facilities will respond. It's scary because the system has a lot of uncertainties, and both in terms of whether we'll hit that 120,000 value, but also in terms of where do we go after that. So here's the non-water supply issue. This is the latest temperature modeling at the planned flows, and you can see it inside the dashed boxes. The dashed box on the left that says lethal for juvenile steelhead. Basically, those are temperatures in excess of 72 degrees Fahrenheit at Watt Avenue. That encompasses about 70% of the steelhead spawning area on the Lower American River, and extended temperatures up to almost 78 degrees, or up to 78 degrees, but above 72 degrees for almost the entire month of September. And that is, it's just death. The biologists tell us we don't need a mortality model. That's going to cook them. And we recognize that steelhead is only a threatened species. It's only a threatened species and not an endangered species like Witter Run. We recognize that the steelhead in the Lower American River only represents 20% of the steelhead in the Sacramento River Basin, but we still think they're important. And we know the fish agencies do. Pardon my snark. The other dashed box you see on the right is temperature conditions in the fall. That's going to affect spawning fall run Chinook salmon and incubating salmon, next year's brood. And basically, as we approach mid-October through mid-November, we like to get temperatures down to 58 degrees as soon as we can. Salmon, the fall run basically won't start making reds and spawning till we get to 58. So while they're holding, they experience something, a euphemistic term the biologists call pre-spawning mortality. Basically, those unlaid eggs start to cook inside the fish. Once they spawn, we want to get temperatures down to 56 if we can. And there you see a prediction that shows temperature never getting to 56 until it gets really cold outside. And that's bad. So that's what's bad. Here's what we propose. we propose that Reclamation, the fish agencies, Department of Water Resources, sharpen their pencil in the way they compute net delta outflow. As we understand it, and again, this is outside of our wheelhouse, but as we understand it, a big component, net delta outflow is not measured, it's computed using a bunch of inputs. One of the primary inputs is delta depletion, and those values are not updated on a real-time basis. We've heard that the delta diverters are voluntarily significantly reducing their water use, so we think there's an opportunity here to account for that. And if there is a reduction in depletion in the delta, let's move some of that, back some of that into Folsom. In essence, that's our proposal. 2 other slides. I'm jumping to the end. This is my perspective. This is a water balance of the major water balance components of Sacramento Valley and the Delta. You can see that, and this is expressed in cubic feet per second, right? So we all think in acre feet. 400 cubic feet per second for a month is 25 TAF, right? So we're talking about a request to reduce diversions at Folsom between 200 and 400 CFS. That's 12 to 25 TIF per month. That's equivalent to 5 to 25% reduction in the delta depletion. So it's in the bounds. I also want to point out in this graph that how big the Sac Valley ET part is. We're not suggesting that change. We understand people have water rights, people have planted crops, but it lends credibility to the story that uncertainty is huge. When the flow to the atmosphere through evapotranspiration is 12,000 cubic feet per second in the Sac Valley, if it gets a little hotter or a little cooler, a few percentage point changes in that depletion shows up in the delta, which means it shows up at Folsom. And so that's part of the uncertainty that we live with. Just a glimpse of how much we think these kind of changes can help the fishery in the lower American River. The dashed line is the curve you saw before, dead zones. We can't eliminate stress. We can't get to a good situation this year, but we think we can avoid the majority of mortality for this year's crop of steelhead, this year's brood, and reduce mortality for fall run from something like a vast majority to something less than a majority. And this is all preliminary. I'll also add that we're working with Reclamation to do a bunch of other things in basin, things like deganging shutters, things like real-time temperature management, and those will help this as well, but this is the potential that we're talking about. And so thanks for your time. Questions, comments?
Basically, thank you. This is quite interesting, and I think the thing that it sort of builds on something that Steve Moore mentioned earlier. While we're focused on on the delta or on the federal projects and the state projects, it all is connected, and we need to be able to incorporate these real-time savings that Sacramento and the citizens of this region are contributing. We need to make sure that those are available so that people can know if they've got some flexibility. So I really appreciate this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to hear from Reclamation about this. And are there, as is often the case, when you turn one dial, maybe it impacts some other aspect of the system. So if you could comment on first of all, what you think about this, and then secondly, if it has, maybe some other unintended consequence.
Well, the easy part is, yeah, it probably does have some unintended consequence, but can we figure out what that is and kind of iron all that out? Yeah, our struggle has been with trying to navigate through the changes with the temperature plant at Shasta is, to Tom's graphic, is that we're going to have to release a lot of water in the July timeframe to be able to reliably be able to say that we could meet the delta outflow objectives and maintain the salinity down the delta. And there was only so much flexibility the state had with regard to Oroville ops. So by front loading that release, that's kind of illustrated here, really does take a big hammer to the cold water pool management question. Even with these, I don't think these are great numbers, but I think, as Tom kind of described, they're kind of survivable. I think that those flows are probably storage neutral, Tom. I'm just looking at the bar charts, but don't necessarily address the first question.
Although, as you pointed out, it delays hitting the 120 point, which could avoid capacity issues.
So we'll take a look at this. I think certainly the question was very helpful with the, where I think we're trending on the in-delta depletion number as it relates to July or to June. July in our TUCP we're down to 3,000, and then we start getting into territory where we may need the flow to meet salinity as well. So it's not necessarily as easy to say, oh, if we can check that box, we can do this. But any flexibility here is going to be helpful. And if we do see that delta depletions from a Sac Valley standpoint start to be more along the line of, let's say, last year's numbers instead of maybe something worse, which is currently in some of our tools, one of the places we wanted to try to back up is so that we could try to manage these temperatures. Now, I think within the Water Forum and the American River Group, the right balance of, let's say, the steelhead management, and because there's some techniques that you can maybe prioritize steelhead a little bit more than the fall run on the backside in the fall, but I think that's the forum that we should, pardon the pun, Tom, the place that we should probably try to balance that question, because we got a listed species versus a non-listed species, but really important.
Right, and our
segment of the
charge is
fall
to
run.
deal with all species and balance versus just the endangered ones. I would, I know you're going to be having more conversations, and I just would suggest that in those conversations you also include some of our water rights staff. Just explain what we could count, what we couldn't count, what's happening with curtailments, whether it would or wouldn't make a difference. The Delta Water Master you may want involved if you're thinking about it. Again, because things seem like a good idea if the math works, but there's more to it there too. So I don't know the answer, nor would I opine on it if I did, but I do think that has to be part of that conversation of everything we can do. I think clearly people are concerned about what you're concerned about. So some more conversations definitely in order before this gets to whatever approval.
Yeah, and we have been involved in those conversations regarding any modifications to the net delta outflow index, and are actively involved in those discussions.
Terrific. And you touch base with the Delta Water Master as well?
Yes, he is also actively involved.
And I would go a step further and say that we're in general agreement and working towards a solution on this. So
That's encouraging.
Yep. It took courage to get outside the basin, didn't it, Mr. Goring?
Yes, sir, Mr. Moore.
I appreciate it. Are there any monitoring refinements that could go along with this type of discussion? Because we talk about, an age-old issue with calculating delta outflow. Are there some monitoring resources that Fish and Wildlife or Reclamation or DWR have that you would help answer these questions and refine the calculations, or can you handle it on the modeling level?
I think that's the type of thing we need to work with the water master on, to figure out how we want it, because this has been kind of an age-old black box. I mean, this is something we probably needed to tackle in some form or another for a long time.
Yeah, and
there's a
we
reason
are.
it's
The question
been-
is, how definitive are we going to be in this short of
Right.
a time? Right.
I do think for this year, our our ask as the projects as it relates to June is a number that's probably easier to attainable as a question. That's, yes, probably within that range. It's hard to say what that number really is. And then as it might relate to the rest of the summer, at some point we are going to cross the threshold where you need at least enough releases upstream to manage the salinity, even with the barrier in place. And, you know, I'm sure to try to channel both Larry, Rabin, and Carl, you know, their concerns with the pelagics is that as we do this, we're not overly creative with the math, that we're actually cutting into the outflow, that may be having a inadvertent species concern with the pelagics. So I think there's a place we can land here that's not the answer, but it may be something that takes just another little increment off of the pressure at Oroville and Folsom. And, you know, they did a great job of making the case that completely unorganized or unorchestrated, I might add, that we need a lot more water up in Folsom to be able to manage. And the big hit, back to Marcus's first slide, is that big swath of water out in the July timeframe takes us from a point that if you looked at the storage today, it's, you know, doesn't look nearly as dire as what we might be looking at in September. And it's because of this uncertainty around the July timeframe.
And that is always the challenge with Folsom as the first responder on the Delta.